One of the most dangerous half-truths that Andy referred to was that the observation that the quality of the overall system is dependent on the quality of the teacher. And there's a half-truth because what it's done is led people to focus on human capital only, to focus on it in a ham-handed way, actually, as we'll say in this, and not to build up the profession. The second thing to step back and think about is what's the action agenda? And I'll go back to Albert Shanker, 1985, the president of AFT, one of the most radical unions there was for teachers. And he said in 1985 in several speeches, here are the characteristics of a profession, he said. 3 things. They're devoted to the client, that was the language he used, as much as to themselves. They collaborate, and they build a body of knowledge that's soundly based in effectiveness. And then he said, if we don't pursue this agenda, the one he just described, we will be on a treadmill, and within 10 to 15 years, we will suffer politically, economically, and socially as a profession. They didn't take that agenda. They did go down the path, became more and more vulnerable to the ad hoc human capital forays into the profession, to the point that the deprofessionalization of the teaching profession in the US in this case is worse than it's ever been. Jal Mehta from Harvard, young sociologist, wrote a wonderful book just about a year ago, less than a year ago. It's called The Allure of Order. And it's a great analysis of the teaching profession the last 50 years in the States. And he says, a wonderful line, just absolutely perfect. He said, what policymakers are trying to do now at the back end with intrusive accountability is what they should have done at the front end with capacity building and professional capital. So we begin to see the action agenda here, and I want to give a few examples as well as portray something for you to think about, is that we have, as the profession's been deteriorating, people have been good but not effective, but they put their energy into fighting against what is happening, but they haven't put the energy into fighting what should happen. So that you're against something, but you're not for it. And what Andy described in the first 15 minutes here is the elements of what we should be for. The political battle, I'm going to say, and the content of it is professional capital. When we think of the places that we have worked, and in all of these cases, it's about whole system change. This means the country, the province, the state. It's not 1 or 2 schools, not even a district. It's the whole system, whatever. We put the boundaries on that. And if I think of the places that we've worked, and I won't take them all, but just the most instructive for the points I want to make. Ontario, we have had the last 10 years of mostly up until the last year, being able to focus on an agenda that was initiated from the center, but immediately became a partnership, not only vertically, but horizontally. Schools and districts learning from each other. And we built up the capacity and the professional capital in the province to quite a strong degree. And last year when the government fell apart, which for reasons we won't get into, the major benefit of that first 10 years is the teaching profession and the school heads, and in this case the district superintendents. They didn't need the government to be effective, to continue to be effective. They could do without the government. As long as it didn't interfere and try to deliberately undercut it, which was the case. The government, I'm going to say, was neutralized, and the profession took over. And good things continue to happen because of that. So we have that example. Toronto district, a big district, 500 schools, very terrible at the top. The trustees, 22 trustees, always fighting, micromanaging, creating all kinds of havoc for leaders at the district and the school level. The director of education resigned because he was caught publishing articles that he didn't write in the Toronto papers, plagiarism, so he resigned. All kinds of turmoil at the center. But that at the other layers within the district, within the schools, teacher leaders, they began to use strategies of schools learning from each other, of teachers learning from each other, a whole set of things that really made a difference for that, and the results showed for it. We just did recently, I did with Alan Boyle, a comparison of New York City, London, and Toronto. The last 10 years, what were the policies? And you see in that case that Toronto, despite its lack of leadership at the center, flourished in the sense of really effective turnaround of schools, really effective building up of the profession. Still could be better because it wasn't coordinated. There was a lot of noise in there. We think of British Columbia, I'm thinking of Judy and Linda here. British Columbia, although we don't put ourselves too much literal credibility in the PISA results, we use that as a way of thinking and getting behind the numbers. British Columbia showed well in this last test, and they've had terrible conditions at the center. Unions and districts and the government constantly fighting all the time, year after year, decade after decade, one could say, yet they still did well. So my point about this is that you don't need the center, and that especially if the center is not in good shape, if it's doing the wrong things. We've given up in the US, I work a lot there, Andy does. We've given up on the federal government. They'll never get it right, at least in our lifetimes, I'm thinking. Secondly, that we put our money where the state is. So last example, California. 30 years of decline, lots of problems at the center, decline of budget. Now a new mix of new governor, new state superintendent, the union that Andy works with, the districts, 1,009 districts. And we call the strategy, and I adapted this from the study that Andy did in Ontario of 10 districts focusing on special education and what they did to develop it. And they coined the phrase leadership from the middle. So when I'm thinking of California, when we go there, this is how they talk, this is how we talk. We are going to build up, in this case, leadership from the middle. And leadership of the middle is the capacity of schools and districts to work together laterally and to build up. When you have the center that doesn't have its act together, when you have a lot of ad hoc pieces, as the case in California, Netherlands, where I just came from, you have to, where's the coherence and capacity building come from? In this case, we're saying the center, the middle, build up the capacity of people to learn from each other. So we can detail those strategies, but I think it's clear that there's a lot of other ways of doing this, and we no longer want to depend on the center to get it right. We no longer want to just spend our time fighting the center because they're getting it wrong. So that's the theme of what I'd like to take, and I'll call it the directional solution. We think it has 3 parts. Collective autonomy. This, if I put it in teacher terms and school head terms, you should want to have autonomy from the center, but not from each other, laterally. You should not want to have, if I put it in a job description, I would say teachers have a job description responsibility to learn from other teachers and to contribute to the learning of other teachers. That's the nature of the job. School heads, you have a responsibility to learn from other schools and to contribute to the learning of other schools. But we're talking about this as a fairly long and developmental process to build up the strength. You become better partners laterally and vertically if you do this development of the capacity at the center in this case. So collective autonomy, again around the world, Australia, other places now, they're moving towards site-based management, school autonomy, independent schools, free schools, whatever words they use in whatever countries. This is the enemy of systemness. Isolated autonomy, whether it's a teacher or a school, is the enemy of systemness. Collective autonomy, where there are clusters together, is not. And also in the OECD terms, they are finding that school autonomy without an overarching framework, without an ability to learn within that, is associated with low performance. School autonomy that's plugged in to an interactive framework is getting results. So one of 3 things, directional solution, to build up the quality of collective autonomy, collective learning and action. Number 2, to expand lateral learning, where teachers and school heads and schools of imagination are learning from each other, are beginning to consolidate the knowledge, the effectiveness, the 3 kinds of capital that Andy introduced. And thirdly, building a knowledge mobilization infrastructure. Sorry about the jargon, but you have to have not just the lateral learning, but what's the nature of the knowledge that's being produced and how can it be made more available? How can it flow better for everybody to be able to use that knowledge mobilization? So this is the broad framework that we think is necessary for the professional capital agenda. In your case, and leading from the bottom has many connotations, so I think you'll have to not read everything into it. But because the center gets it wrong, because the middle has been gutted, that is, lots of the middle of the infrastructure, the local authorities have been gutted, what's left is, we think, and this is for debate obviously, and we hope to in our subsessions to interact with this, is that leadership from the bottom means that clusters, in multiple clusters, and I know you have them in some of the chained academies, but these are piecemeal, these are broken front all over the place, is the question of whether individually and together teachers can begin and schools can begin to think of that we are leading from the bottom in the sense we're going to strengthen the bottom tier deliberately in doing that. I just came from the Netherlands, I mentioned, which is a very fragmented system, not so much negative policies, just no policies of coherence. And there were a group of, I met some of the teachers who were in a group in Amsterdam, 100 teachers, who said, we have banded together to learn from each other and to develop this, and we meet and we exchange ideas, we try to influence others, and we're self-appointed, but we're doing the work of professional capital, they said, because the system isn't organized to do that. The professional and political capital, and this is really an extension of what I just said, professional capital, used the way I just described, produces political capital. When we are, one of the districts that we work in, Andy and I, in California, is called Garden Grove. And Garden Grove is just south of Los Angeles. 85% of the pupils are Hispanic or Vietnamese, very high poverty. In the last 8 years, even under conditions that are not, they're improving now, but previous conditions were worse, they had great success. They built the learning of those students and the professional capital of the whole system. And I interviewed the superintendent who's just retiring and said, well, the overall context was quite bad. How did you do it? There were a lot of negative things that were coming at you from the policy level. And she said, every time the state put up a wall, we punched holes in it. Her attitude was, if they're doing things that are interfering with us, we will, politically speaking, small p, figure out how to get around it and be effective despite that. Some of the work I'm doing with Lyle Kurtman on competencies of effective leaders under dynamic systems, Lyle's based in Massachusetts, one of his findings is this, that leaders who are effective at the school level are not compliant for the sake of compliance, but they are influential for the sake of learning. In other words, they don't follow rules, but they do have a focus where they say, we're going to accomplish something, and we're going to be influential within this context. We're not going to be following compliant rules. We don't disregard them just to be rebels, but we sort out what's effective and what's not effective. The content in this sense of political capital is professional capital, or the reverse, one could say. The superintendent of Garden Grove, she built up her political capital to get away with not being compliant because she had the professional capital of success and the power and the linkage to the community and all of those things that developed this. Here's a bit of a loaded question that we've just been addressing recently, looking at the role of the principal, especially in the United States. The principalship is evolving rapidly, almost accelerating, evolving with a development of how do we increase the intensity of instructional leadership. So we have their checklists, their walk around, their instructional rounds, their teacher appraisal. They've built up the bureaucracy to micromanage instruction. And so they have a lot of these new tools, teacher appraisal frameworks that are useful in terms of their knowledge base, but are misused because what they are based on the assumption of, if we evaluate these teachers, reward the good ones and punish the ones, or get rid of the ones that aren't so good, we can improve the profession. In other words, a ham-handed human capital strategy without anything else. It doesn't work that way. Teacher appraisal, we think about tools, incidentally. A fool with a tool is still a fool. A fool with a powerful tool is a dangerous fool. So teacher appraisals are running amok, but let's just be commonsensical. There is no way that teacher appraisal can impact teacher performance on any wide scale because it's not intensive enough. It's ad hoc. It's not motivational. But aside from that, it's a weak intervention. Professional development looks like it should. CPD looks like it would be a winner. Very broken track record, and I think the reason was captured best by Peter Cole in Melbourne, Australia. He wrote an article in 2004 that has this intriguing title, Professional Development, a great way to avoid change. So you can't help but read that article. You read it, he says, people take courses, they go to workshops, they go to conferences, they take master's degrees, but not much happens in between workshops, the day-to-day work in between workshops, which brings us to collaborative cultures. Collaborative cultures, not to be taken just as simply interacting. Andy will elaborate on that in a few moments. But collaborative cultures are strong enough to make a difference because they happen every day, day after day. You can't escape that the learning culture, and we're talking now not just about a learning culture within a school, but across schools in doing this. So when we think about professional capital, and trying to debunk some of the misinterpretation, what I call the dangerous half-truths. Professional capital can exceed the quality of individual teachers. If you build up the capital of teachers, in Carrie Liana's work, for example, those schools that had high social capital, in those schools, she measured math achievement over the period of a year, teachers in those schools who had relatively low human capital, but on the average happened to be in a school with high social capital, got better. They had more results, more effective results for it. The power of the group, even though there's one piece of it. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Professional capital chain is stronger than its weakest link. The weakest link doesn't break it apart because it's multifaceted, it's not linear. It has the strength, and this is another way of stepping back from it, the strength and sustainability of an organization is a function of the quality of its lateral relationships. If you build up lateral relationships that have high quality, two things happen. You have more people working on the agenda on any given day, therefore you get better results. And then when leaders leave, top leaders leave, the group carries on because the lateral capacity is built in and the sustainability towards future leadership is already happening as part of the normal work. So Andy's going to talk about the collaborative culture because it's easy to get it wrong, and he'll elaborate on what we really mean collaborative culture and what some of the danger points are.